Hi again, it's Dr. Holly Luttrell from the fashion department at Pasadena City College, and I just wanted to quickly go over chapter 3 with you. So, in chapter 3, see if I can get this guy to work. There we go. So, in chapter 3, we talk about the people that lived in Crete and Greece from 2900 to 100 before Common Era. And here's some objectives that are in the front of your chapter. And your book also has a nice little infographic showing different areas and different facts during different time periods, along with some images that just sort of give you a really quick overview. So again, these people lived in Crete and Greece, and so I took the map out of the book and just put an arrow. So the Minoans were on Crete, and the Mycenaeans were on Greece, or in Greece rather. And there's a whole bunch of detail in your book about their background and how the leadership in the government and the culture and the people shifted throughout time. But we do know that they were pretty sophisticated. They have excavated a really amazing palace that had a whole bunch of different rooms. And I have a few pictures of some of the inside stuff that they found. So up here there's a throne room, and then you can see it's a huge structure, that because I think these are depictions of like what size people would be if they were in this structure. So again, it's enormous and it's elaborate, and you see all those bright red pillars. They're still bright red to this day. This is a fresco that they believe was on the floor. It was on the floor of a room, and they believe it was one of the queen's rooms. So really vivid and beautiful. So they had amazing craftsmen. This is an image of the interior of a throne room that was in the palace. Again, they had really vivid colors that they used, and they got it from all different sources, plants and minerals and sea life. This is a relief of a bull. They found evidence that this civilization may have had running water. So here we see a bathtub and then some channels that would have directed water. They think they even found like restrooms in this palace that had water that would drag the waste away and allow people to wash their hands and things like that. So again, it was a very strong, advanced culture, and they did some travel and some trade, but there was some shifting in the civilizations. This is a fresco of a popular sport at the time, where guys would wear these special outfits that we'll talk about later, and they would try and flip over bulls, kind of like the Spanish have their bullfighting. Here they weren't trying to kill the bull, they were trying not to get killed by the bull while they did some stunts over it. This was still a society with social classes, and so there were the upper echelon and the lower echelon. While it was still patriarchal, women did have a higher place in society, and of course the wealthier upper echelon got all the cool stuff, which we get to see some of that in the following slides here. And again, this is so long ago that most of the sources come from durable goods like frescoes and things made out of stone and metal. And we don't have a whole heck of a lot of evidence. We have a little bit more than we did from older civilizations, but we do know that they had more sophisticated looms, and they were able to create more complex weaves. They also would do different treatments to the fibers, and they had different fibers. And the evidence that we do have is that they had a lot of color in their costume. So the scholars argue over whether their costume during this time was more drapey or whether it was more tailored. Drape means you would take like one piece of fabric and do minimal stuff to it, but you would kind of wrap it around your body. And tailored means that you would cut the fabric into shapes and then attach the shapes to each other, so you get more of a 3D fitted garment. And the costume components for men and women included the perizoma, which is like a loincloth, and it's close fitting. It's kind of like their version of shorts. Men wore skirts. They were elaborate and patterned and colored, and some of the short ones ended in a point in the front, and they were weighed down with a tassel so that they wouldn't blow up or flap up. And then for those bull flipping activities, bull leaping activities, they had special shorts with a reinforced crotch. They also had some other special equipment, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Women's skirts were mostly bell-shaped, and they seemed to find evidence that there were three kinds. One was more fitted at the top and then flared out at the bottom, so a fit and flare or an A-line. And they had a series of ruffles or flounces or something. So some images look like they were ruffles or tears, and some look like they could have been like a series of circles where like the woman would stand in the center of the circle and the outer edge of the circle would fall towards the ground to create a ruffle type effect. They also had V-shaped ruffles or flounces or something. Sometimes they would wear an apron-like cover over the top front part of the skirt. And again, it's hard for them to tell if the pieces were like pieced into the fabric or woven into the fabric or sewn on top like an applique, or like a ruffle where the bottom edge wasn't attached and it would blow up with the wind. So it's hard for them to tell exactly what was going on. And then they find evidence of things like this, where it looks like it could have been a bifurcated garment, kind of like pants, like full leg pants, like palazzo or culottes. And they're not sure if this is just like a artistic thing where the artist put a line down the center just for decoration, or if these were actually pants, or is it a wrapped skirt? So they're not really sure. Women's tops, they sometimes had a fitted bodice, usually with sleeves. Some of the sleeves were puffy, but again, we're talking about a pretty big time period. These images are depicting goddesses. They don't think that the average woman went around with her breast exposed, but again, they're not really sure. So then we have some evidence of Minoan costume, and they liked jewelry. Obviously, the higher up you were in the social class, the more you got to wear and the more elaborate, because these things cost money. So they had earrings and necklaces and bracelets and rings and earrings and things to decorate their hair and everywhere, ankles, feet, everywhere. They decorated their hair and they wore headdresses. So they had curly hair. They were just born with it. And they would pull it back and they would wear that headband again, like we saw in the previous chapter, which is spelled like fillet, but it's pronounced fillet. They had footwear. But they don't think that they wore them inside buildings. So like we saw that fresco of the dolphins in the beginning that was on one of the floors in the palace. So floors like that were really well preserved, but they saw where at the outskirts of buildings, like in entrances. So they think that people would take their shoes off before they went inside. And those bull leapers had some special shoe with a sock or some kind of an ankle support, presumably to help them do their sport better, their bull leaping sport. So they did have shoes and they had various kinds. There isn't a whole lot of evidence about what children wore. They could have gone relatively scantily clad. until a certain age, at which they, at which point maybe they decided you'd earned the right to wear clothes, but they're not really sure. So they transitioned. It was a similar garment, but it just sort of morphed a little bit. Again, this was a really long time period. So we looked at the Sumerians last chapter, which was 3,500 years before Common Era, and now we're 2,900 years to 1,100 years before Common Era. So the garments are similar, but they've transitioned a little bit. So the Sumerians wore those konakes, and the Minoans, they're still clean shaven, and their skirts are more often tiered, and they're kind of like the konakis, but a little bit different, more color, as far as we know. Again, we don't have a lot of evidence less evidence about the Sumerians, and they did have color, we just don't know how much of it was incorporated into the garments. And we still have the parasomas, and some of those are kind of skirt-like. These back ones especially, it's easier to see those tassels that they used to make the front of the skirt stay down, we think. So then we have the Greek civilization, and they had some transitions. So they went from what's called a Dark Ages into an Archaic period, and their structure, their society changed a little bit. And they shifted again into a classical age and a golden age, and they had more philosophers. And their empire grew and changed shape a little bit. Their socialization, or their class structure, for the most part, it was patriarchal. So women were still less than men. They had more complicated fabric and cloth production. They were getting linen from Egypt. They had wool later on. They were importing cotton. They still had lots of color. They were getting their dyes from plants and minerals and from shellfish. And they were weaving different patterns into their cloth. They have little fragments of evidence of textiles from different parts of the area. And here's a little scrap of cloth on the left, and then a diagram of what that cloth looked like with a little key down below showing the color differentiation. And again, the colors may have changed with time, so they may have been different colors, but when this piece was found, it looked like this piece of fabric had yellow, red, and black or gray, and it could have been clothing, but they think it may have been like a flag, or like a ceremonial textile that may have been draped over something. And then here's another textile fragment that was also in different colors, and it depicts a person that they refer to as an Amazon, or a large woman who's riding a horse. And so there's different colors, and again, they can't really tell what colors they used to be. But right now they were pink and yellow and green, and it looked like there were some stitches, specifically maybe a chain stitch used to embroider the fabric. Oh, and they also had a satin stitch to do some embroidery on the fabric. So again, things were changing, and they were trading with other people. So below you see a depiction of women treating wool and spinning it, and then they have it stretched out on a loom, and it looks like they're dyeing it somehow. And what they were doing now was, instead of weaving a piece of fabric that was the shape and size that they needed, they were weaving longer pieces of fabric and then probably cutting it into shapes or into sizes. and they were developing new ways to treat the fabric. So I don't know if you've ever had something that was wool and then you put it through the washer and dryer and it got really thick and stiff and shrunk. They were using um, techniques like this on purpose to change the texture, at least of certain maybe stripes in the fabric, or to make denser fabric, to make thicker woolen coats maybe for travel or blankets. Um, and instead of making, like, a guy comes to you and says, I need some fabric for my chitin, and you're like, okay, I'll make you that fabric. Instead of doing that, they were doing something that was more like mass production, where they would make a bunch and then bring them to market. And again, they were using all kinds of different fibers, and the textile production was getting more elaborate. So people had specialized jobs, or specialties at least. And our sources of evidence are still things that were durable, like things that were made out of stone. So here we have some statuary, and then also some pottery that survived all these years. So this is an image of one kind of a garment, which is a Dorian peplos, and it looks to be like a single layer of fabric, like kind of a skirt, and it's belted, and then there's something that's more shirt-like, that's either sewn or cut in a way that the arms can come out. And here we have some statues. The one on the left is wearing a chiton, and the one on the right is wearing a himation. So a chiton is like a tunic. It's usually a single layer of fabric, and it's wrapped around the body and pinned at the shoulders. And on the right, we have some images of some of the pins that they would use to hold their garments together at the shoulders. And the basic garment was manipulated in a few ways. So they could move where they put the belt. They could put it under the bust, or they could put it at the waist. And then they could have a really long piece of fabric and then put a belt and then pull the fabric up and sort of blouse it over like a peplum. And then they could change the locations of the pins, so they could have them at the shoulders or on one shoulder, or they could have multiple pins to sort of create something like a sleeve. And these chitons were worn by both men and women, and they changed a little bit over time, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But the Doric chiton was mainly wool, and then the Ionic chiton didn't have any pins at the shoulders, and it was linen. And then there was a Hellenistic chiton, which was more clingy and belted under the bust, like the statue that we see here on the left. So this is a himation, and it's a garment that was just one large rectangle of fabric, and it was draped or wrapped around the body. And then the piece that's the last piece to come around, you could either throw it over your shoulder or and across your back, or you could throw it over your arm, drape it over your arm rather, just depending on what kind of a look you were going for, or maybe what you were doing or what you did in life. So here's some images of some of these chitons. Other garments that they had at this time was something called a diplax, which is a small rectangle of fabric that women would wear over their Ionic chiton, and they usually put it over their shoulders, kind of like a himation. So it would go over one shoulder or both, and maybe drape over an arm. And then they had a fancier version that was pleated, that was a chlamydon, and that's what the woman on the far right is wearing, a pleated chlamydon. So a peplos was a heavy woolen garment, and they would take a big square of fabric, a big rectangle, and they would fold it in half, and then they would attach it at the shoulders, and then they would belt it at the waist, and then they would sort of pull the fabric up from under the belt, and they would create the koplos, which is the bottom folded part you can see, and the apoptygma, which is like an upper single layer that you can see on top of that folded layer. Usually the more fabric, so the fuller and drapier something was, it was a symbol of something higher, something more elevated. So it could have been wealth or some sort of status. Other garments were the perizoma, or the loincloth, the chlamys, which is a rectangular cloak, the exomus, which is a piece of wool that's fastened over one shoulder. This was more for lower class people. The petasos, which was a brimmed hat that would give you a little shade or protection from the rain. The pilos, which is worn by both men and women. It was a little hat with no brim. And then the Phrygian bonnet was not Greek, but it's depicted in some Greek art, and they think that Phrygian bonnet is to symbolize some foreigners, some visitors, or some travelers that were visiting the region for trade, probably. So the Phrygian bonnet, it has no brim, and it's sort of similar to the pilos, but it has more of a protrusion on the top, so it kind of sticks up and then curves a little bit towards the front, or curve or fell towards the front. So your book has a nice visual summary table. Again, these are not primary images like these are. These images that you see here were created during the period in which these garments were worn, and an artist made a depiction of these just to make it more clear what these garments probably looked like and give you an easier time trying to identify them. So here's mostly primary images. Again, just my own little visual guide. So we have the Dorian peplos, which was wool, and it was slimmer and not as drapey, and that was worn 560 before the Common Era. And then next we have the Ionic chiton with a chlamydon and like a shawl worn over the chiton. And then we have an Ionic chiton and a more elaborate diplax, which that should be kind of slid over a little bit over the third picture. And then we have the last three, or the next two, have Doric chitons, which are still some draped garments that are fastened at the shoulder. And then on the far right we have a Hellenistic chiton, which is light and clingy and tied under the bust. And in your book, there's a nice little table. It doesn't have pictures, but it has nice descriptions to help you see the differences and the similarities between these garments. They did have shoes, and we have evidence of that mostly from statues. We can see what their shoes look like, and they looked mostly like sandals. There were some boots that laced up the front for travel or for war. They did wear some beards, and younger men were clean shaven. The guys had long hair. The women had curls that they tried to arrange around their face, and they would pull their hair back into a knot or a chignon, and they would wear that headband again, the fillet. And then they would also use ribbons and scarves and caps and veils in their hair. And there's a visual guide in your book of some of those hairstyles as well. Your book talks a little bit about wedding dress. On the far right, you see some purple snails. That's where they would get murex, which was a purple dye that they would use for special occasions. The Hercules knot is depicted on the right in gold. It was a ceremonial knot that symbolized either, like the untying of the knot symbolized either the woman detaching from her family and going to the man's family, or the tying of the knot would symbolize the two families, the bride and the groom, coming together. The Stefana was a crown that the bride would wear over a veil, and the anacalypteria was the unveiling of the bride. And then they had nymphides, which were the bride's sandals, and clonis, which were a kind of tunic that the bride would often make and give to the groom as evidence of her housewifery skills, because usually this would be made from scratch. So military dress included like a breastplate that was made of metal if you had money or were of a higher social class, or of leather, which would usually indicate less wealth. And then they had something called greaves, which could also be made of leather or metal, and those would protect like from the knee down. They were a little bit like armor, the cuirass and the greaves. They did have some helmets, and they had some retractable cheek plates. And you can see all these are primary images, items that were made and worn by people that lived during these times. At the end of your book, there's a list of these terms, which are also in bold throughout the chapter. So there's some key terms that you should know after having read the chapter and gone through this video or the PowerPoint. So that's about it for this chapter, and I'll see you in the next one.